Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. This is Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at CFN, and I'm not joined by Brian McCall today. He is asking for your prayers at the moment. Unfortunately, his father looks like he might be in his final days, so if you could say a prayer for Brian's father, I'm sure he would appreciate it. We talk about this a lot, how our prayers have a real efficacious impact, especially when we're talking about the Catholic Church, the members praying for each other. So please do that. If you don't mind praying for my family as well, there's my grandmother and another member of my family. They're not looking in very good shape as well. It looks like there's they might pass away soon. So a little bit of a tumultuous time here at CFN, but we still wanted to bring you a number of very important news stories. Now, the way this is going to work, today we have a big show talking about Charlie Kirk's assassination, the devastating assassination that took place a little over a week ago now. We're going to have more coverage on that as well. I'll be there in Glendale for that actual memorial service and covering the memory of Charlie Kirk there. That's going to happen this weekend. We also tomorrow have a show dedicated to looking at this new interview that Pope Leo the 14th came out with Crux, a very strange interview. It was recorded on, outdated microphones and you could barely hear him, but there were some real bombshells dropped there. However, what we're really focusing all on today is this monumental event, Charlie Kirk's assassination, because this really does impact every facet of life within the Western world, and that includes traditional Catholicism. And I'll talk about what I mean by that and why this matters here in a second. But I do think that's important that we put this in the Catholic perspective. We're not just viewing this from a sort of naturalistic or a materialist perspective, but we're actually viewing this through the Catholic perspective, the whole entire plan of salvation history. Where is this leading? The restoration of Christ and the reign of Christ the King in the modern world. We have to look at things through that lens. But in order to kick us off with that, before we get into the actual nitty-gritty details, I want to look at the liturgy for this week. There's two really important saints that are coming up. Today, of course, is St. Joseph Cupertino. This is a saint that has, forgive a bit of the pun, but there's a bit of a cult following. There's a literal cultist behind St. Joseph Cupertino, but there seems to be some really dedicated people behind his veneration. And that's because St. Joseph Cupertino was not some intellectual scholar. He was not a St. Thomas Aquinas. Usually we see with the saints, oftentimes their writings can correspond with their holiness. They seem to be very eloquent in how they speak about things, speak about the faith, even if that's just orally. For example, with St. Dominic or St. Francis, they were very elegant preachers. So we usually associate eloquence in expressing the faith and intelligence with, that person there might be a sign of holiness there. Well, St. Joseph Cupertino was definitely not that. In many of the older books, he's described as simple. I guess that's not the politically correct way to put it anymore. To say the least, he was not an intellectual scholar by any means. He was not intellectually gifted. But what he was intellectually gifted with is a noble simplicity, a simplicity of being able to offer God his own sacrifices, really with complete purity, to offer the purity of his heart completely and without any constant doubting of himself. He was able to really just give himself entirely to God. And he eventually was even made a priest and fulfilled his priestly ministries faithfully as well. It's said that and what he's very famous for in all of the artwork is that he started levitating once. He would just spontaneously start levitating. All of the pictures the paintings are of him levitating. There's a great film about him as well. It's an old black and white film, I think, that just goes by his name, that I think actually does justice to the saint as well. So St. Joseph Cupertino, an important saint, I think, especially for today, where we might be tempted to think that we have to have a complete moral certitude about every single bit and piece with the crisis in the church. I've talked about this in my lecture with the Roman Forum, but there is a temptation to want that moral certitude when in reality things are not black and white in today's modern church, because we live in a crisis. And what that leads us to say is that we live in this gray period in the church, and we really, that's where we have to find God. That's where we have to put our trust in God, because it's not easy. And God appreciates our sacrifices. God appreciates when we give up that need to feel secure and certain in every single aspect of life, and we're able to give it up to God. And so I think this is a great saint to look to help us with that in our modern age. Another saint is this weekend, which is the one of the of course the evangelists, the apostles, Saint Matthew. Now, St. Matthew, I go back and forth if I like his gospel or St. Luke's the best. St. Matthew, that was the first gospel I read completely, because you just read them in order, and it really is striking. I think after Saint John, it might have the most character behind it. St. Luke has a lot of character in his gospel as well, but St. Matthew, a tax collector, and that gives him an interesting perspective as well. There's a lot of people that doubt, these modern scholars, did he actually write the Gospel of St. Matthew? Well, I think, he's a tax collector. He's obviously going to be literate. I think it matches up, and you can see that character behind it as well. You can see the character behind the Gospels in writing it. And he died a martyr. This would have been a man who would have been seen as really one of the worst jobs you can have when it comes to your reputation around others, right? Because it's oftentimes associated with injustice, being a tax collector. But he ended up really proving himself. He sacrificed himself for God by being a martyr. The tradition goes that he died in Ethiopia, which is an African country, one of the first Christian countries, and that he died by one of the king's bodyguards there. But what do we always say? We say the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. And that certainly was the case. Ethiopia became a very, when we say prosperous, I mean spiritually prosperous Christian country. Unfortunately, it ended up going into schism down the road, but it was for many years, many centuries, a very important Christian country that led Christendom to its eventual height. So a very important country and I don't think it would have been the Christian, the stronghold for Christendom that it was without St. Matthew's martyrdom. So all of this is important to keep in mind, because we're seeing a trend, we'll talk about this today, of self-sacrifice. And I think that's very important. If there's anything we can take out of the tragedies that we've seen in the past few weeks, it's that there is a need for Catholics to buckle up and get ready to be self-sacrificial, because there's so much love that can come out of that. There's so much meaning that comes out of that. And I really do think that's the gospel. That is the essence of the gospel, is redemption through self-sacrificial love, giving yourself up for another. It might not be an easy thing, but it's something that you have to do with a noble simplicity. But if we give ourselves up in that way, and again, it's difficult, but if we give ourselves up for others, and especially for God, who is sustaining our existence at all times, that I think is the essence of the gospel. And that leads us in to our story for today, which is this Charlie Kirk assassination. I'm sure most of you have heard it. We do have some listeners who only get their news from CFN, and maybe you didn't hear this at work or something like that. Maybe you live in a rural place. Well, unfortunately, September 10th, Charlie Kirk was assassinated. He was shot at the UVU campus in Utah. He was sitting at the bottom of this sort of central place within the quad, within this college, and he was shot in the neck. And it said he died instantaneously, actually, instantly. There was some talk that he had a pulse afterwards in the hospital, but everybody that was in the car with him said that he did pass away instantly, it seems. This is the beginning of his big tour, because some of you might be asking, I've had people ask me this, well, who was Charlie Kirk, and why was he so important? Well, Charlie Kirk started something known as Turning Point USA. You might have seen some videos about that. You might have seen that logo at various conservative rallies. They're the people behind America Fest. I met many of you at America Fest last year. And really what they're about is campus activism. It is the largest youth conservative group in the country. And it has even expanded into Australia, into the United Kingdom, really throughout the world, of being youth, especially campus conservative activism, which is something conservatives have always struggled to do. Actually get a youth movement behind conservative policies. The youth is almost always been characterized as being radical reformists. Well, getting the youth behind the conservative message is very important. And Charlie Kirk was a driving factor in getting Donald Trump elected. Of course, Donald Trump got a lot of the youth vote this time around, more so than usual. There's been all this talk about Gen Z, moving more to the right. And that's because, look, I think Gen Z in general is very confused. And Gen Z knows the modern society we're living in, which is godless, which is without any sort of organizing principle. It's not working. And Charlie Kirk stepped up. He founded Turning Point USA, organized it really all by himself. He had help around him, but really he was one of the hardest working people out there. I saw him live in America Fest. I did not know Charlie Kirk, but certainly I think anybody from the outside looking in can say this man was a very hard worker, and we need more people like that within Catholicism. Now, with that being said, he was, by all accounts, mainstream, and that's an important thing. And we'll get into why that's important. He was not some kind of radical, especially, I mean, even by modern day standards, I don't think you could say he is a radical. Certainly a lot of the things that Catholic Family News says, the traditional Catholic perspective, is going to be more hardcore than Charlie Kirk, who was a sort of run-of-the-mill Protestant, took his faith very seriously, but was a Protestant still at the end of the day. There's some controversy behind that even, but was just a conservative. He wasn't some sort of rad trad. Some people have called him a fascist. That's ridiculous. He was a mainstream conservative. Another important thing to note is that he was also very pro-Israel. And we'll talk about, especially on Locals, a big segment on our Locals channel here, we'll be talking about, well, did Israel play a role in that? There's been a conversation about that. Well, by all appearances, Charlie Kirk, up until his death, was pro-Israel. Now, there might have been some movement on that, and we'll talk about that, but he was a pro-Israel figure. Now, how did Charlie Kirk die? This is something extremely important. It can be kind of forgotten about because, and I think it can be overlooked, how Charlie Kirk died was in a massive, gigantic spectacle. This was not in a secretive, cloaks and daggers poisoning of Charlie Kirk. This was not a mysterious, a helicopter explodes, his private jet crashes mysteriously. He died in what had the effects of a political spectacle. It had the same effect in what people felt like afterwards as if you saw a public execution. Or the thing that's come to my mind, what is really pressing on me, is that this had the same effect, I think, that the French Revolution's reign of terror had back during the 18th century. I think it really did have that kind of effect, because it wasn't just, as I said, Charlie Kirk mysteriously disappears. No, he died in a public, extremely, almost a theatrical way, in the way that people saw this and the effect that it had on them. And that's very significant, I think. It would be different if this was just, as I said, a cloak and dagger kind of thing. No, it was much bigger than that. It had a major effect. Now, what does that say? He dies in front of thousands of young people in person, millions of people online, tens, hundreds of millions of people online. It has a big effect. Well, we have to focus on that effect, because as soon as Charlie Kirk was shot, and this is what gets us to why this is important for traditional Catholics. As soon as Charlie Kirk was shot, he became an idea. He became an idea that is extremely, and a very powerful one at that, because you have a lot of conservatives that can sort of put their message onto Charlie Kirk. And he becomes a rallying sort of figure. But it has the reverse effect as well for those who hated Charlie Kirk. He becomes an idea that they rally against. This is extremely powerful. And later on, we'll talk about why I think that really does matter in figuring out who killed Charlie Kirk, how this happened. But for now, I think it's very important that we lay out he became an idea instantly, irrespective of who killed Charlie Kirk. The fact that he became an idea instantly makes this significant for everybody, because this is not just a whodunit. No, now we have created an idea very similar to the JFK assassination. And as I said, the reign of terror during the French Revolution, it would be foolish to say those events did not matter. It was just a whodunit. Who pulled the lever on the guillotine? No, this is about an idea that is created, a zeitgeist that is created, a moment in history that can impact everybody, especially when we look at the context in which Charlie Kirk was in before he got shot and afterwards. And this can let us know what repercussions this has for us as traditional Catholics. So, well, why was Charlie Kirk there in the first place at UVU? This is a Utah college, a lot of Mormons there, a lot of ex-Mormons. Ex-Mormons, I will say, this is going to be something that develops over time. You notice this with people who leave the traditional Catholic movement. You see this with people who leave the Mormon movement, is that there is oftentimes, and you see this with traditional Catholics who had a false understanding of what Catholicism was. Oftentimes they go the complete opposite direction. They try to rebel against authority in any way possible. There were certainly a lot of them there at UVU, which is why I think Charlie Kirk chose this place. Because what Charlie Kirk was looking at, what Turning Point USA was looking to do, is to get, as I said, as many youth into the conservative movement as possible. What some people miss is the method in which Charlie Kirk did that. Yes, it was about changing people's minds, but in a bit of a different way. An important thing I think Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA and all of these different Republican conservative groups are doing is they're not just trying to convince the people they're arguing with, these radical leftists who are screeching and yelling and exposing themselves and all of this crazy behavior when they come up and ask Charlie Kirk questions, which is what this session was. Charlie Kirk sits down, asks these leftist questions, they ask him questions, and they have a dialogue. All of this, I think, was about trying to get sane, more moderate, anybody to the right of the far left, people to say there's something wrong with these people. Because the context in which, right before Charlie Kirk came to the UVU campus, is that what did we see? Well, everybody up until 2024, it's really starting there, even going long before that, people were calling Charlie Kirk a fascist. And I want to take our listeners back to 2023, where what did we see happen? The FBI came out and said that traditional Catholic groups need to be investigated and surveilled due to being extremist organizations. What did they base that on? They based that on a report by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which went after groups, including Catholic Family News. You can see on our Wikipedia page, you've got the people working for them that will say, we're an extremist organization because we're anti-Mason, anti-communist. They say we're anti-Semitic. They said all these things. There was a report by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Who else did they publish a report on? Charlie Kirk. Southern Poverty Law Center said he's an extremist, he's a Christian nationalist, he's a fascist, he's enraging people, he's going to try to destroy democracy. They said the same things about the traditional Catholics. And they said that about Charlie Kirk. It riles everybody up. Every one of the mainstream outlets uses this report from the Southern Poverty Law Center and all these other liberal, faceless outlets that say this man is an extremist, this man is anti-democratic, and it riles the youth up. You've got the professors, they parrot these talking points. You've got the leftist organizers, they parrot this. And all of a sudden, the context is that Charlie Kirk, the fascist, is coming to our campus. This man is trying to take away our rights. He's anti-democratic. He is evil. And the other thing that's very important to understand when we talk about democracy, when they say he's trying to take away democracy, he's trying to destroy it, is that they have something very specific in mind when they're talking about democracy. They don't really mean that. The actual leftists who are speaking about democracy, Brian and I have talked about this on the show a lot. They're really speaking about this in a postmodernist sense, in which it's not just we want a liberal free market. We want like democracy that England was back in the 19th century. That's not what we're talking about. They're talking about a utopian, anti-Christian vision of society, which is why they hated Charlie Kirk. In their minds, promoting any remnants of the, as they would call it, a patriarchal and oppressive system like Christendom, any sort of remnants of that is evil and anti-democratic and therefore needs to go. And because they're viewing things through a materialist lens, a utopian lens, where we're going to bring about the end of history, the greatest, the greatest society ever, a utopia. Well, therefore, we need to achieve that by any means necessary. And so when Charlie Kirk arrives on the UVU campus, there is not just conservatives and liberals, clueless college students. There are people there who hate this man. And there were many people, even before Charlie Kirk got to the campus, who were saying, watch out, Charlie Kirk, better not come to school tomorrow. That's what they were saying. And that's because this ideology has infected a sizable amount of the population. And we saw the fruit of that afterwards. Now we're getting into the effects of the shooting. And I think this is important before we look into the whodunit aspect, which is really secondary to what we're talking about now, which is the actual impact that this had. So after Charlie Kirk passes away, gets assassinated, shot, after that happens, what do we see? What does the reaction look like? Right after that, almost instantly, up until even now, you see tens of thousands, if not, and that's just the people that have been recorded doing this, who published this on their public accounts with their full name. Tens of thousands of Americans celebrating his death and wishing it on even his children, on people who share the same beliefs as him, celebrating that violence. And even with one of the most brutal, grotesque, terrorizing videos that I've ever seen. Even after people saw that, these callous people take to the internet to celebrate this man's death and to promote it, to continue to promote violence. Tens of thousands of people. We also have to think about how many people, if that is in this country, and if that's in this culture, people around the world doing that, how many people are doing that privately? How many people are harboring those feelings, anti-Christian, celebratory over violence, those kinds of feelings? How many people are doing that privately? Something to think about. And every time you see these people, and this gets into a big debate that's going on the internet right now. Why was Charlie Kirk shot? Some people are saying that the reason why people are celebrating is because, he was anti-Palestine. And again, we can talk about the Israel side of things, but I guarantee from the vast majority of these people, the reason why they hate him is because he promoted Christian values. It's not over the Israel question. It is over the question of this man was promoting the traditional family, these basic conservative aspects. Traditional family, didn't want children mutilated, wanted a stable households, that kind of thing. They hate him for that. And so this is something very important to think about for us. They hate him for something much more moderate than what the traditional Catholic message is, which is talking about a complete restoration of the kingship of Christ in this country, of an actual integration of a moral, just society with the state, with an integration of the church and state while keeping them distinct, still keeping them integrated. What would people think? What would these monsters, these despicable, ruthless, and bloody people, what would they think of us? And that's very important. We have to take that to heart, that if they're willing to do that to him, we have to think that these people are willing to do that to us. And even then we'll be even more enraged They won't, even if we have an audience here that is, many times we've talked about the persecution of the Christians in Gaza. I am confident that these people would not be more lenient on us over that, because these people hate Christianity. They hate the person of Jesus Christ on a much deeper level. And that's something I think we have to wake up to. I think we have to get past seeing this on a political level, because fundamentally they killed Charlie Kirk out of a hatred of Christ. And we'll talk about here in a second whether that's actually a true martyrdom. We published an article, a fantastic article by Ryan Grant today on our website. We're going to look at that. But he was killed out of a hatred of Christ, out of a hatred of good morals, because Christ now represents a return to sanity. The foundations on which our society and our culture was built has to be kept in mind. This needs to be a wake-up call. Well, so what are the other reactions? Well, first I want to look at the mainstream conservative reaction, which I think was really good. This is, we've criticized Trump and the Trump administration in some ways. There is some things that I think especially the FBI deserves criticism with, when we're going to look at the actual investigation. But recently, just over the past 24 hours, Trump announced that Antifa was going to be labeled as a terrorist organization, something that should have been done a long time ago. Antifa, for those who don't know, it stands for anti-fascist. And they're a far-left organization, mainly made up of communists. You know, Marxists would be the better term. Some of them, as with all of these people, they're divided into a million different sects within their own camp. You have syndicalists, you have communists, you have socialists, and anarchists, all kinds of different things, and also divided among their billion different sexual orientations they also idolize. But this anti-fascist action was back, especially in 2020, and before that, would form these large protest groups that were meant to just shut people down, oftentimes being very violent. And the state would routinely give Antifa a double standard when it comes to how they treat conservative groups versus left-wing groups. These groups just went off scot-free. So this should have been done a long time ago, especially when they were very relevant. But I think that was very good from Donald Trump. The thing I'm most proud of is the amount of people who have been saying these obscene things, celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk. They're actually losing their jobs. There's been many independent groups who have been cataloging all of these different incidents and have actually been holding these people accountable. Many people have gotten fired to different degrees of deserving it. For example, Jimmy Kimmel was fired. We still don't really know what he was fired for. In my honest opinion, they were just looking for an excuse to get rid of him because his ratings were so abysmal. I genuinely don't know who watches Jimmy Kimmel nowadays. I've never seen somebody who's a fan of Jimmy Kimmel, but he got taken off the air allegedly because of his words on the Charlie Kirk shooting. But there were many other times with many people who are much more egregious celebrating his death who have also lost their jobs. And that's going to continue. That's very important. And I know there's some people, even in the Catholic movement, who have been saying, you know, we don't want to do that. We don't want to sink to their level. Look, this is absolutely something that needs to be done, because if society doesn't have an incentive, or a disincentive in this case, to not be bloody, ruthless, antisocial, and hateful in the most extreme way, celebrating somebody's violent death for no reason, and then wishing it on their children, on his children, it absolutely needs to be kicked out of society. Those people have no place in a Western civilized society, especially if they're also coupling that with an anti-Christian, anti-Western perspective of communism, of Marxism, which that's not. I've heard a lot of people say there were a few commentators. I can't remember who exactly said these words, but that's not up for debate. It can't be, because if we're constantly questioning about the foundations on which the society is built, you can never grow. You can never have a civilized society. So that's absolutely something that needs to be, the gas needs to be pressed even further. We absolutely need to stick on that. Now, last thing before we get into the sort of who did this perspective is I want to look at the Catholic reaction, which, of course, from our bishops was completely disappointing. Within a few hours of this whole thing happening, what did we see from the USCCB? Some of you might have seen this. Before the Charlie Kirk shooting was really getting off the ground, we knew about this. We wanted to have a whole story dedicated to this. I think this is only something we should really mention in passing because there's so many of these. But they released an article saying that DEI means God. That's what the USCCB put out. And in one of the most chaotic times in American history, the USCCB is not condemning political violence as they did when George Floyd died. They were crawling on their hands and knees over that. What are they talking about instead? DEI means God. You have this ridiculous bishop coming out with an argument saying, well, DEI, Dei, means God in Latin. Get it? That was his argument. As if that's what we need right now. As if that's accompanying, it's walking together with the faithful. Absolutely not. USCCB thankfully put that down. We've gotten no meaningful response from the USCCB. So when we hear all this talk about the USCCB, the Catholic bishops in this country are walking with us, walking together, want to hear what the faithful have to say, who is their base? I get the sense sometimes that the United States, the Catholic bishops in this country, I think they're under the impression that the majority of people that go to Mass, that are the people putting the money in the coffers, that are people who are faithful Catholics, are like liberal, like left-leaning millennials or something like that. When in reality, I'm confident in saying this. I think there are some left-leaning people who sort of begrudgingly accept the Catholic Church's pro-life teachings and try to do that seamless garment thing of applying it to, we also need open borders. I think there's some people like that who adopt Catholicism out of a genuine faithful sense, but also because of the cultural impetus behind it. They see it as an intrinsic part of who they are. But I think the vast majority of Catholics in this country, faithful, practicing Catholics in this country, and really in the West entirely, are conservative. Are people who are sending their kids to college hoping they're going to get involved in TPUSA, are sending their kids to college and watching people who are defending pro-life measures on campus. They're not people who are begrudging. I think the base in this country of Catholics should not be, they're left-wing people who begrudgingly accept the pro-life values in this country. And I don't think that is the case. The majority of people are actual conservative who are practicing Catholics. And yet the USCCB is almost always kicking them down. And it's something very discouraging. It's something why we've always said, and this sort of ties this part up, and this is something we have to say, is that we need to find, and we need to make it a priority, to get in safe communities. And that involves getting in places who share your ideals, who share your perspectives on things. If you're in a city where everyone around you hates you, which now it's a wake-up call, there's a lot of people who do. There's millions of people in this country who want you dead for holding the traditional Catholic perspective on things. We have to just get real. That's a fact. They would have no problem if you were killed over your beliefs. That's just a fact. But we also have to take it in a spiritual sense. There's a lot of people who don't care if you're spiritually going to die. It doesn't matter. They see it as an impossibility. We have to get in places where it's healthy spiritually, where you're confident that your priest would have your back on these issues, on basic pro-life, not wanting children to be mutilated, those kinds of issues. Yeah, that's something you want your priest to have your back on. And nowadays it's increasing. I'm not saying that doesn't exist in diocesan churches, but more and more it's becoming segregated to traditional Catholic churches, FSSP, SSPX, ICKSP, all the Latin Mass groups, the Eastern Catholic churches too. It's becoming something more and more impossible to find in a diocesan church. And I just think it's something as Catholics, we really need to come around saying, let's get real here. Let's figure out where we need to be safe. And that involves our material safety, our political safety, but also our spiritual safety as well. Last thing, before moving on to that whodunit, I want to look at this martyrdom question. If you go to CatholicFamilyNews.com, you will see a great article. I'm going to pull it up here from Ryan Grant, who, again, it's really I was very happy he did this for us. Let's pull it up here. There it is. You should be able to see it on the screen. Ecclesiology and the response to Charlie Kirk's murder. I suggest you read this in full. He goes over in what ways can we call Charlie Kirk a martyr. And I do think this is something that's very important because, look, Charlie Kirk, we don't have a complete clarity as to where he was spiritually. We know that he was a great follower of Jesus Christ. And I think a sincere one too. I don't think many people who were raised in the traditional Catholic movement, you don't know how dark it is out there, where there's a lot of people who are desperately trying their best and are even open to the traditional Catholic faith. And even as Charlie Kirk said, there was an interview I saw where he said, my biggest obstacle to Catholicism is Pope Francis. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being open to that and you're kicked down by the USCCB and Pope Francis? It's something to think about. Well, here you see a picture. He and his cradle Catholic wife, Erica Kirk, pointing there at the National Shrine in D.C. I know close to me is St. Bernadette's Church. They're in Scottsdale in Arizona here. He's always been seen there, going there. There's even some interviews where he called him his pastor, the pastor there at St. Bernadette's. Michael Hitchborn had some comments saying that he thinks that Kirk was in the RCIA. I think that Ryan Grant's perspective here is very good in that, can we call him a martyr in the strict sense that he died in hatred for the Catholic faith? No, I don't think we can say that. The Council of Florence is very clear on that. That's even a case with some of those Miaphysites that died in Northern Africa. When they said they're martyrs, we have to be consistent. If you're dying out of the clear, visible bonds of the Catholic Church, it would be wrong for the Catholic Church to say he died for the Catholic faith. I think even Protestants can understand that. We're not going to lie and say Charlie Kirk died for the Catholic faith. But what we can say here, and what I love part of this article, is there's precedent. The first Archbishop of the United States, John Carroll, Ryan Grant's so good at finding these historical things. During the death of George Washington, a hero who might have died a Catholic, there's some conversation in that. I don't think that's true. Ryan Grant has also debunked that, or at least cast some doubt on that. But certainly a hero for Americans. He's the Archbishop in the United States, John Carroll. Archbishop Carroll said he instructed that clergy should not honor Washington with any funeral rites or preach about him religiously, but should give him a secular eulogy as they would for a non-Catholic in ancient times. I agree with that. And that doesn't mean you have to disrespect him. Obviously, it's a great deal of respect. Look at how Dante treated Virgil in Dante's Inferno. Tremendous respect given there. Look at how St. Thomas treated Aristotle, or Newman treated Cicero. That's, I think, the respect that there's a level of respect we can give to Kirk. We can pray for him, as Ryan Grant proves in this article, and that's something we should definitely do, because God he's not bound by the sacraments. And even somebody like Garrigou-Lagrange in his book Life Everlasting, this was in the early 20th century. We certainly live in a much more chaotic time. I think God might be more lenient. Garrigou-Lagrange said there's many Protestants who are so confused that they have a chance of being, especially if they're baptized and they have a true and sincere contrition, that many of them can be saved through the extraordinary workings of grace of God working outside of the sacraments. But it would simply be wrong for us to call him a martyr in the strict sense. I think that's appropriate. And I think that deals with that topic. It's important that we get that right. We don't want to step out of bounds in any political way, calling for violence and things like that. And similarly, we don't want to step out of bounds religiously by going to one of the opposite excesses and say he is a martyr, he is a saint. We have to keep a balanced perspective here, and I think Ryan Grant has a great perspective on how we can do that. There. So, moving into the whodunit aspect. This is the more complicated part of this, and this is something that a lot of people are upset about. Excuse me there. A lot of people are upset about. A lot of people are wondering about. A lot of different opinions have been expressed about this. Some people call them conspiracies, whatever you want to call them. A lot of this has been raised. Well, again, let's go over the issues. Well, Charlie Kirk was assassinated about midday, about 12:30 on September 10th, the day before 9/11. Immediately, it was chaos. On the ground, one of the strangest things happened where as soon as Charlie Kirk was shot, he was shot in the neck area. Again, in a very graphic video. Immediately, somebody on the ground said, "I shot him," and he was apprehended. It was an old man by the last name of Zinn. I want to be careful by making these people famous. They shouldn't be famous. And in the case of the shooter, we have to be the actual person, the actual suspect, we have to be very careful about that because that's giving them what they want. But this clown on the ground, Zinn, said, "I shot him." He was apprehended. Immediately, there were some interviews from people on the ground who knew this guy as sort of a local clown, as a kind of jester. He'd always be sort of making a fool out of himself, known in the community as being a joke. There's some very prominent interviews from people who said, "I saw him. This man's not capable of doing it. He's crazy. He's an old man." Well, he was arrested. It looks like he's going to be charged with obstruction of justice. He also had explicit images of children on his phone and has been arrested for that. We have to be careful with what we say here on YouTube. He was arrested for that crime. And he said that the reason he said it is out of an instinct to try to get the shooter to give him time to run away, to create a distraction. And he said he just did this instinctively. Bit weird. Is that out of the question? Not. I don't think so. I think there are some crazy people like that, especially if they're infected by an ideology and half crazy, saying, "I shot him" immediately. I don't think that's out of the question for him. Now, we also found footage immediately afterwards where the roof across from where Charlie Kirk was shot, there was a man who immediately bolted right afterwards. So I want to show a picture here. Gives people an idea. For our audio listeners here, what we're seeing is a sort of map. Where this worked is there's this sunken in part of the quad there, if we want to call it the quad. It's just the best thing I can call it, sort of in this diamond formation on the ground. Charlie Kirk is in this sunken in area speaking under a canopy. Now, about 200 yards, a little less than 200 yards away, there was a rooftop that was very easily accessible and has direct line of sight on Charlie Kirk. Now, I want to address something. Some people were saying when that was first announced, this must have been a professional. That's a very difficult shot. I want to say personally, I don't think it was. I'll give my reasons here. One, I think anybody who's even shot a gun, been around people who have been acquainted with firearms, knows that it's not that difficult of a shot in the first place, especially from a high vantage point like that, a clear line of sight. Yes, the shooter would have been nervous, but he would have been having his gun propped up. I just don't think it would have been that difficult of a shot. The other reason why I don't think it was a professional shooter, and there's been a lot of analysis on this as well, is every single person who's been trained in self-defense or any kind of instruction would say you aim for the center of mass. Well, Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck, which insinuates that the shooter was aiming for the head, which is, something a professional would not do. And that he missed the shot. It dropped lower because of the distance, and it hit him in the neck. Now, there's some videos that people have said it bounced off of the vest. That seems to be based on a false viewing of the actual video, thinking that it bounces off. Charlie Kirk had a lapel mic on. Some people interpret that as being the bullet, that it bounced off and hit him. It doesn't seem that's the case. I want to address one more thing you'll see a lot of people bring up in this, is that people on the ground said that this happened close, which is why a lot of people thought this Zen character who was on the ground and said, "I did it," that he was the shooter. Because to many people on the ground, it seemed like it was very up close, especially people around Charlie. They said this happened very close to him. Well, that's also, I think, very explainable. They're in a sunken in location in a sort of arena, in a sort of auditorium like place. And of course, it's going to echo. The sound is going to resonate and seem a lot closer than it is. The proof I would use to really show that this did come from that roof that's on the that's being shown on screen here about 200 yards away is people on surrounding upper levels. Immediately when the gunshot went off, they turned their cameras to the roof. They didn't turn it downwards, which you would expect. If this came from the ground, somebody had shot him there. And again, there's been a lot of kind of out there theories of people using palm pistols and all this kind of stuff. I just think we have to use sort of Occam's razor here. The more simpler explanation is the one I think that should be investigated first. Again, all of the evidence needs to be proven. I'm not saying that should be censored or anything like that. I'm just, you can make up your own mind. This is not a sort of dogmatic thing. But in my personal opinion, that's what happened. There was a shot from the roof. And there's further evidence of this. There was immediately, we actually do have footage of, we have the footage of the man running away, but then we have footage from the back of the building where he jumps off of the roof. Now, it doesn't look in the video, it's not entirely clear if he actually has a firearm. To me, it is discernible that he has one. Some people have doubted that. They've cast doubt into that. But then the shooter ran away, and it was completely left unknown where he was. Even that video, it was left a complete unknown. That was until later. The investigators released a photo, very grainy photo, of a man who was in a American flag t-shirt with an eagle on it. One that seems to be sold mainly to veterans, but this wasn't a veteran. I think he got this out of it's a strange shirt, I will say. One, I think he could have gone, sort of a military surplus store or something. But many people have said this gets shipped off to veterans. But it was easily discernible what the man looked like and who he was. And according to the story, there was his father had a man saw the photo on screen, said, "That's my son." Asked a pastor for advice on this. It seems a Mormon pastor, which it doesn't seem to be the correct term for that, but he asked a pastor and told his son to come to his house and turn himself in. Well, then we got more and more information as to what happened. And that's because of a transcript of texts that was sent, that was given away. And this was from a roommate of this suspect, last name of Robinson. Tyler Robinson is his name. Again, I don't think we should make this person famous. His roommate was transgender and said, "I'm going to cooperate with investigators. I'm going to show these texts." Well, here is the text exchange, which we'll talk about. This is very strange. This entire exchange is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. I have censored the explicit remarks that were mentioned here. I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube, but I also think we should maintain a sense of decorum here. But this is from the roommate. This is from an interview and an exchange that was given across. The suspected shooter said, he had committed this crime. The roommate said, "What?" We're going to go through the whole exchange. The suspected shooter said, "I'm still okay, my love, but I'm stuck in Orem for a little while longer yet. Shouldn't be long until I can come home, but I got to grab my rifle still. To be honest, I had hoped to keep this secret till I died of old age. I'm sorry to involve you." The transgender roommate said, "You weren't the one who did it, right?" The suspect said, "I am. I'm sorry." The roommate said, "I thought they caught the person." The suspect said, "No, they grabbed some crazy old dude." That's referring to Zen. Then interrogated someone in similar clothing. "I had planned to grab my rifle from my drop point shortly after, but most of that side of town got locked down. It's quiet, almost enough to get out, but there's one vehicle lingering." The roommate said, "Why?" Robinson said, "Why did I do it?" The roommate said, "Yeah." Robinson said, "I had had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. If I'm able to grab my rifle unseen, I will have left no evidence." Pausing there. Yeah, you left no evidence except the written exchange in which you confessed to everything and narrated the entire outcome of what you've just done. Insanity. But that's what he says. "I will have left no evidence. Going to attempt to retrieve it again. Hopefully they have moved on. I haven't seen anything about them finding it." going on. The roommate said, "How long have you been planning this?" Robinson said, "A bit over a week, I believe. I can get close to it, but there is a squad car parked right by it. I think they already swept that spot, but I don't want to chance it." Robinson said, I'm wishing I'd circled back. I might have to abandon and hope they don't find prints. Only thing I left was the rifle in a towel. Remember how I was engraving bullets? The explicit messages are mostly a big meme." Pausing there. So this is something they did discover, and this is something they knew even before they had Robinson, is that the bullets had some engravings on it. And I'll get into this when we talk about some of the questions about who this man was. There's been a lot of traditional Catholic commentators. We'll come back to this in a second. This exchange. A lot of traditional Catholic commentators who got the analysis of that bullet's wrong. And that's because they're completely clueless about the actual what's on the bullets. Because it's very weird. I don't expect anybody to know these kinds of stupid things on these bullets, but I do think some journalistic investigation should lead somebody to be very careful about what this is, because on there was a remark referring to one said, "Hey fascist, catch," and it had a video game reference to sort of a video game move basically that would strike the person. There was another message that was very popular in some of these degenerate queer communities. That's what this shooter referenced there. Then there was another message that said "Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Ciao, Ciao," which is a reference to an anti-fascist song that was used in Italy in the 1930s. Now, that song, for a very brief period, was used ironically in some right-wing circles like 15 years ago, as ironically, as if, making a joke, haha, get it, we're turning this on its head. That hasn't been done, anytime recently. It was for a brief period about 10, 15 years ago. Ever since then, it's been abandoned by these right-wing communities because it's been totally adopted sincerely, that Bella Ciao song that is engraved on these discovered bullets, by communists. Obviously, it's an anti-fascist song, very popular one meant to protest Mussolini's regime. So those were the bullet engravings discovered. I want to pause for a quick second. I've even seen traditional Catholics say, "Oh, the bullets were associated with right-wingers, with Groypers," they'll say. Those are followers of Nick Fuentes, Catholic right-wing commentator. And they'll say that was associated with them. It absolutely was not. And it's a shame that any of us bought into that. I'm not going to say us. Any traditional Catholic bought into that. That was propaganda started by the left in order to pin this on the right wing after they had just got done celebrating this. Ridiculous. But those are the bullet engravings that they're talking about. It was clear anti-fascist, communist, degenerate messages that were put on these bullets. Yes, with some video game references, but most of these Generation Z people are going to have that incorporated. That's a part of this guy's online culture. The guy was a very online, it seems, antisocial guy, has this transgender boyfriend. That's not terribly out of the norm. It's not as if right wingers are the only ones that play video games. He goes on to tell his boyfriend, delete this exchange. And then he says, "My dad wants photos of the rifle." He says, "Grandpa wants to know who has what. The feds released a photo of the rifle and it's very unique. He's calling me right now, not answering. Since Trump got into office, my dad has been pretty diehard MAGA. I'm going to turn myself in willingly. One of my neighbors here is deputy for the sheriff. You are all I worry about, love. The roommate says, I'm much more worried about you. Robinson says, don't talk to the media, please. Don't take any interviews or make any comments. If any police ask you questions, ask for a lawyer and stay silent." Okay, here's what I think. This right here, yes, it seems very contrived. And the thing that strikes me is that this is narrative. I extremely doubt he never told anybody about this, about his plans, as if he just randomly came up with this idea. I don't think that happened. But it's extremely strange that even in that case, somebody who's apparently very worried and very confident that he can get away with this crime, that he narrates his entire wrongdoings on text, on a recorded, archived text. What is he doing? Doesn't make any sense. Why would somebody do that? The other thing I think many people have pointed out is that it doesn't sound very organic. I see somebody in the chat, KO, you say, it doesn't sound like an organic chat. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like somebody faking a Civil War letter to his love, my love. Ridiculous. That does sound very contrived in a way. Now, something to know is that the suspect, which again, we're saying suspect here. I'm saying that out of a sense of sort of respect to some of the people who've offered alternative theories I don't find very convincing, but he is right. I mean, he's innocent until proven guilty. That's a foundation of our legal system. He is right now the suspect, even though all the evidence is pointing that he is the killer. He still is going to get his day in court. But I do think that if you look at the guy's background, he was a 4.0 student, got a pretty significant scholarship, and was also, I think you can look at some of the videos of him talking, was likely on the spectrum to some extent, was autistic. Very difficult socially when interacting with people, very strange mannerisms when speaking. I think it's very likely he was autistic. And I think just by judging his profile and by the fact that he's going with his transgender roommate boyfriend, I can almost buy that the my love stuff and the way he's the sort of strange way of talking, he's calling his car my vehicle and stuff like that. Ridiculous. But I can almost buy that somebody of his profile would do it. I don't buy that he would narrate this entire thing. I think the key is at the beginning of this chat that was released is he told his roommate, look under your keyboard. There's something there. The police have determined that there was a message under his keyboard left there. Which that's what the police have determined. We don't know what the message said because it looks like the roommate burned it. I'll give what some people have suggested that might have been. One is that it was instructions to the roommate to report him into the police. Why? This gets despicable, and I hope the police are smarter than this, but it was in order to get the roommate to collect the reward money, because it was said the first one to turn in Tyler Robinson, the suspect, or whoever the suspect was, giving information that would lead to the arrest of the suspect, that would come with a pretty hefty amount of funds, especially from various private individuals who put up a lot of money as well to find the killer. The theory goes that the instructions were for the transgender person, the roommate, to turn in the killer in order to retrieve that money. Presumably, some people have said for his transgender surgeries, because it wouldn't be provided for by Utah. That's one theory. Another theory is that he had, and this gets into the more conspiratorial sides of things, is that this was for it was a pre-planned hit, and the killer got a hefty sum of money. He was giving that to his love, this transgender person, and that it was like Bitcoin codes or something like that under the keyboard. I think that's the key behind this. I do think it's a very narrative thing, at the very least, to try to get the transgender boyfriend out of the limelight, out of the being seen as guilty, and only convict himself. Because I do think Tyler Robinson, from all of the radicalization that he has received, it's because it's very clear from people around him. They've said he was a radical leftist, that he had been leaning more left recently, that he hated Charlie Kirk, and as he said on this message, that he hated Charlie Kirk because he thought he was a fascist, that he thought he was spreading hate, and that he was going. And I think that Tyler Robinson killed Charlie Kirk in order to vindicate his transgender boyfriend, to get sort of respect from his transgender boyfriend, and maybe get him some money at the end of the day too. Last thing I'll mention on the sort of mainstream part of this, the mainstream theory on this is that there were, and this has been heavily reported, a number of his neighbors reported very strange people around the area, around where Tyler Robinson's roommate lived, for a few days before this shooting happened. Recently, before the shooting happened, and that these people had out-of-state license plates. The insinuation that these were very strange, LGBT, far left people that gave everybody a bad vibe. So, and this leads me back to my what I've been continuously saying. I think this was there does seem to be a more sinister part of this that was pre-planned, and that this was discussed as a group, because there were a lot of people beforehand saying, a good number of people that are strangely, there's ways that you can connect them with the killer. And the killer was involved in all these different Discord chats, Discord servers that seem to have been very far left. And of course, he has this transgender roommate. You've got these weird people showing up that with out-of-state license plates, which what we would expect is if you're in an online group of a radicalized far-left element, that you would have out-of-state people meeting to discuss this and maybe send off this character to go kill Kirk in a triumphant fashion. That was the idea, but this was a planned meeting of many different individuals. And what scares me about getting him attention is these far left organizations are very often connected with satanic elements, with accelerationist elements. We talked about this during the transgender shooting a couple of weeks ago. These people who want to rapidly accelerate society to be, create a race war, to create a massive destruction of the Western world, that is what they wanted to happen. Various satanic groups that we've been seeing on the rise recently, and they mix this with far left ideology and want to cause as much chaos and terror as possible. And that suggests there's an organized element involved here. And so, look, to sort of wrap this part up, I'm glad that Donald Trump has been going after Antifa. I'm glad that people have been going after groups of people that have been, as I mentioned earlier, celebrating this. There is something more that needs to be done. And I think we have to look at the organized part of where this might have come from. Because I think it's very likely, if we're taking the mainstream narrative on the surface, and on Locals we'll talk about some questions. Really, I don't believe the alternative theories. I think there's more questions on that side and some more suspicious things on the alternative theories than many people are looking at. But if we're taking this mainstream theory and even just looking at the effects, we have to look at organized, violent, far left, satanic, and accelerationist groups that are causing terror across the country. Because I just simply do not buy that this was lone killer decides to go kill Charlie Kirk, wakes up one morning and tells his tranny boyfriend, "I did this for you, my love. I just decided that morning, and I'm going to send you this very strange narrative text and a conspicuous thing under your keyboard." I think there was something more to this. So there needs to be something investigated, and these various terror groups across the country, there needs to be something more looked into, because we have a virus in this country of hateful antichrists roaming around, and it needs to be stopped as soon as possible. And the state ought to be used to protect the common good of faithful people in this country. And that's something I think we have to look further into. Now, we're going to be talking about some of the alternative theories over on Locals. I don't want to mention them on here because, again, I do think that the standard narrative fits. If you have an alternative opinion on it, leave it in the comments. There is some worry about censorship. That's why we go over to Locals. But, personally, I just haven't seen enough evidence. There's not been enough really material evidence that's come out to make me say this was a cover-up by the FBI, that Tyler Robinson was not the killer, that there was a foreign state like Israel involved. And look, as a final note before we move over to Locals, is I have been at the forefront of talking about Palantir and Israel and some of the dangerous things going on in the Middle East for a while. Even looking back when, I'll give an example, when J.D. Vance was made vice president elect for Donald Trump, I remember I told a group of traditional Catholics, this could be a problem. Palantir, big tech, that's a problem. Their connection with the Israeli government and the influence that AIPAC has on the United States, that's an issue. And I was given, through a lot of very, prominent people, I was given, that's ridiculous. Why are you worrying about that? Stop asking those kinds of questions. You're making us look delegitimate, illegitimate. That's the response I got from a lot of people. And I'll say it's a bit weird seeing a lot of those same people come out now and say, if you don't think Israel killed Charlie Kirk, you're compromised. You've received a payout. Where were those people when we were talking about this a year ago with actual, real concerns? Where is United States foreign policy going? How is big tech connected with the United States government? I just didn't receive that response there. Many of those same people are now saying, if you don't buy this without any shred of really material evidence, which I'll go into on Locals, you're somehow a compromised individual. I don't buy it. I just simply don't buy it at this point. If you do, I think it should be investigated. I think everything needs to come to light. If there is a foreign state involved in the killing of this man, it needs to come to light, needs to be investigated. But at this point, I have not received convincing evidence outside of people doing a pressure campaign against people and saying you must believe this without evidence or else you are compromised as an individual, even though, this is kind of a glib way of saying it, but we were saying this before it was cool and receiving a lot of heat from it. Just go on our Wikipedia page. Southern Poverty Law Center was calling out CFN a long time before some of these people who have now decided that there's a conspiracy. So that is a worrisome thing. I'm not trying to gatekeep it. People need to do investigative journalism, but there needs to be more material evidence, I think, that comes out. The questions need to be asked, but I don't think people should be having a pressure campaign against them saying you're illegitimate if you don't buy this theory, despite the evidence just simply not being there and a good amount of evidence to the contrary. So that's my take on that. We're going to explore that a bit more on Locals. Last thing, I want to end this with a prayer. I want to ask our Blessed Mother. I know some people don't like prayers on YouTube videos, but this is something I think we can say. Let's just take a moment. Let's say a prayer. Let's say a prayer for Brian's father, and we can also say a Hail Mary for the repose of the soul of Charlie Kirk and for his family as well. So let's say 2 Hail Marys. So if you can join me in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. For Charlie Kirk, repose of his soul. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. I'll see our local supporters over there. We'll be going over some of the alternative theories to this. If you have questions over there, you're saying, why don't you address that? I'll hear you out. This needs to be an open conversation. Things need to come to light. Let's see what you have to say. But thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back with our regular program next week. Again, tomorrow we'll have another show specifically on Pope Leo's interview. Thanks for watching, everybody. And may God grant you many joyful years. Thank you, everybody.